December 1944, the Ardennes. Snow fell in silence, broken only by the groans of the wounded. Inside a canvas tent, lit by flickering lanterns, an American nurse knelt beside a man in grey. His uniform carried the insignia of the enemy. She wrapped his bandaged arm again, her hands steady despite the cold. She spoke softly in English words he couldn't understand, and offered water from a metal canteen. The German soldier stared his eyes wide with confusion. He had been taught that Americans were monsters, butchers, savages who showed no mercy, but now the enemy was saving his life. This is the story of the women who defied hatred with humanity. American nurses who treated German soldiers as men, not enemies, and how that unexpected mercy changed the way the defeated saw their captors. Because sometimes the most powerful weapon on the front lines was not a rifle or a grenade, it was kindness. As American forces advanced through France and Belgium in the final year of the war, the front lines shifted with brutal speed. For every mile gained, thousands fell. Americans, Germans. Civilians caught in the crossfire, the earth itself seemed to bleed. Behind the guns, another army worked tirelessly. The Army Nurse Corps, over 59,000 women who followed the men into hell. They built hospitals in mud, operated under shell fire, and faced sights few could bear. Limbs scattered like broken dolls, faces burned beyond recognition, boys calling for their mothers in languages they would never speak again. They erected tents in forests still warm from bombardment. They worked in abandoned schoolhouses with walls pocked by bullets. They slept in shifts, woke to screams, and learned to distinguish between the whistle of incoming shells and the ones that would pass overhead. Some never learned the difference. Yet, amid the wreckage of war, a paradox emerged. Something no one had anticipated. When captured, German soldiers were brought in on stretchers, bleeding and terrified. Convinced they would be executed, those same nurses treated them with gentleness. They cleaned wounds with the same care, administered morphine with the same precision, spoke in the same soothing tones they used for American boys. Some Germans wept in disbelief. Others asked in broken English or through translators a single question that haunted them. Why? Why would the enemy show mercy? Why would women whose brothers and husbands lay dying in adjacent cots offer comfort to the men who had killed them? The answer reveals something deeper than tactics or politics. It reveals how humanity survived inside the most inhuman war in history, how compassion became an act of defiance, how a nurse's touch could shatter years of propaganda in a single moment. This is not a story of strategy or generals. It is a story of choices made in darkness, of women who held the line between civilization and chaos with nothing more than bandages and will, of enemies who discovered that the monster they feared wore a kind face and gentle hands. It is a story the textbooks rarely tell, but it is one that those who lived it never forgot. They called them the angels in olive drab. They came from farms in Iowa and tenements in Brooklyn, from small towns where everyone knew your name and cities where no one did. They were daughters and sisters, some barely 20 years old, who had answered a call that promised only hardship and danger. They trained in haste at military hospitals across America, learning to set bones and tie tourniquets to recognize the grey pallor of shock and the glassy stare of morphine. Then they were sent overseas with little protection and less preparation for what waited across the Atlantic. They landed in North Africa under a sky thick with dust and flies. They waded ashore at Anzio while German guns traced lines in the sand. They parachuted into Normandy behind the invasion forces, their Red Cross armbands the only armor they carried. And when the Battle of the Bulge erupted in the frozen forests of Belgium, they were there too, setting up tents just miles behind the shifting lines. The hospitals they built were crude, canvas stretched over wooden frames, dirt floors that turned to mud when it rained, which was always. Operating tables fashioned from ammunition crates, instruments sterilized in mess kits over open flames. They worked by lamplight when the generators failed, by candlelight when the fuel ran out, by moonlight when there was nothing else. Their mission was clear: save every life they could. No flag, no uniform, no accent could change that duty. It was written in the oath they had taken, in the Geneva Convention they had sworn to uphold, in something deeper still that no document could name. Some were barely in their 20s when they arrived. Girls who had never seen death suddenly found themselves elbow deep in it. Yet under artillery fire they learned to ignore fear. They learned to hold pressure on a femoral artery while the tent shook from nearby explosions. They learned to whisper encouragement in voices that did not tremble, even when their hands did. They learned to pray that the next shell would not hit the surgical tent, and to keep working when it did. To the American soldiers, they were hope incarnate. The last face you saw before anesthesia pulled you under. The first voice you heard when you woke, still alive, still whole enough to matter. They brought letters from home and cigarettes and news of the war's progress. They brought clean bandages and hot coffee, and the promise that someone cared whether you lived or died. But to the Germans soon to arrive on those same blood-stained stretchers, they would be something else entirely. Something unimaginable. Something that would crack the foundation of everything they had been taught to believe about their enemies. They would be proof that the propaganda was a lie. The first German prisoners arrived on stretchers in the summer of 1944, just weeks after the Normandy invasion. They came in trucks marked with white stars, still clutching field dressings marked with swastikas. Their faces were pale beneath the dirt and blood. Their eyes darted, like trapped animals, searching for the exit that did not exist. They refused water when it was offered. They believed it was poisoned. Years of propaganda had taught them that the Americans were barbarians who tortured prisoners and mutilated the wounded. They had seen the posters plastered across every German barracks. Caricatures of American soldiers with fangs and claws. Stories of captured Wehrmacht men hung from trees or burned alive in their foxholes. So, when the nurses began removing their blood-soaked uniforms, some of the Germans cried. Not from pain, though there was plenty of that. They cried because they expected humiliation, expected to be stripped naked and paraded before jeering crowds, expected boots in their ribs and rifle butts against their skulls. Instead, the women worked in silence. Their movements were efficient, practiced, almost gentle. They cut away fabrics stiff with dried blood. They disinfected wounds with iodine that stung but did not burn like hatred. They murmured softly in English words the Germans could not understand but whose tone was unmistakable. "You are safe now. You will survive this. We will not hurt you." One German soldier, a young corporal from Bavaria with shrapnel embedded in his shoulder, later wrote in a letter smuggled from a POW camp, "I thought they would spit on me. Instead, they smiled." He described how a nurse with red hair and freckles had held his hand while a surgeon extracted the metal fragments. How she had given him morphine, even though supplies were scarce. How she had covered him with a blanket that smelled of soap and sunshine, nothing like the filthy wool of his own army. For many, that was the moment the war's propaganda cracked. Not shattered, not yet, but cracked. A hairline fracture in the certainty that had carried them through years of fighting. If the Americans were monsters, why did their women treat German wounds with the same care they gave their own? If this was the brutality they had been warned about, what did that make the truths they had been told? The nurses saw the confusion in their patients' eyes. The way German soldiers flinched when approached, then slowly relaxed when no blow came. The way they watched silent and wary as American GIs in adjacent cots received the same injections, the same bandage changes, the same murmured reassurances. Some of the nurses spoke German remnants of childhood lessons or college classes that suddenly mattered more than any textbook ever had. They translated not just words, but intentions. They explained that the pain would pass, that the infection was treatable, that survival was possible. And in explaining, they became something the Germans had not encountered in years of war. They became proof that the enemy was human too. December 1944, Bastogne. The Battle of the Bulge erupted like a wound torn open across the Ardennes forest. Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allied forces and recapture Antwerp. Entire divisions of German armor smashed through American lines in a blizzard that made the sky and earth indistinguishable. Snow fell thick enough to bury the dead where they lay. The field hospitals were caught in the chaos. Tents erected in clearings that had been safe 1 hour became targets the next, as the front lines collapsed and reformed like a living thing. Shells tore through the forest, shattering trees into splinters that flew like shrapnel. Glass medicine bottles exploded on shelves, surgical instruments clattered to frozen ground. The nurses worked through it all. Inside the 16th Field Hospital, canvas walls rippled from concussive blasts close enough to feel in your chest. The lanterns swung on their hooks, casting shadows that danced like ghosts. Snow blew through tears in the fabric, settling on wounded men who shivered beneath thin blankets. The generators had failed. The surgical team operated by candlelight, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. In one cot lay an American sergeant, his leg shattered by a German grenade. Beside him, separated by less than 3 feet, lay the German gunner who had thrown it. Both were barely conscious. Both had lost too much blood. Both received the same plasma drawn from the same limited supply, administered by the same exhausted nurse, who no longer had the luxury of caring about flags or nations. She moved between them with mechanical precision, checking pulses, adjusting IV drips, wiping fevered foreheads with cloths dampened in melted snow. When the American groaned, she gave him morphine. When the German cried out in delirium, she gave him morphine too. The same dose. The same gentle pressure on the arm. The same whispered words that transcended language. You'll be all right. Hold on. Just a little longer. Outside, the artillery continued its conversation. German guns spoke in deep thunder. American guns answered in staccato bursts. Somewhere in the darkness, men were dying by the hundreds. But inside this tent, in this small pocket of canvas and candlelight compassion, had no uniform. A nurse named Margaret wrote in her diary that night, her handwriting shaky from cold and exhaustion. A shell landed 50 yards away while I was stitching a German boy's abdomen. I didn't stop, couldn't stop. If I stopped to think about the noise, about the danger, about what we were doing, and why, I would lose my mind. So I just kept stitching, kept my hands steady, kept whispering that he would be fine even though I didn't know if he would hear mourning. Another nurse, Eleanor, recalled decades later how a young German soldier had grabbed her wrist as she changed his dressing. His grip was weak but insistent. He pulled her close and whispered in broken English the only words he knew, "Thank you, thank you." Then he pressed something into her palm. A small wooden cross he had carved from a piece of shrapnel casing its edges, smoothed by desperate fingers in the hours between consciousness and sleep. She kept it for the rest of her life. The battle raged for weeks. The hospitals filled and emptied and filled again. The nurses slept when they could eat, when they remembered, and treated whoever arrived on the stretchers without asking which side they had fought for. Because in the end, beneath the uniforms and the languages and the flags, they were all just men, just boys, just human beings who bled the same red and screamed the same prayers. The letters arrived in bundles, carried across the Atlantic by ships that dodged U-boats and storms. They were written on whatever paper could be found, pages torn from medical logs, the backs of requisition forms, sometimes just scraps salvaged from ration boxes, the words cramped and small to fit everything that needed saying into so little space. The nurses wrote by lamplight after their shifts ended, when the wounded had finally settled into uneasy sleep and the night brought a temporary quiet. Their hands ached from holding retractors and tying sutures. Their backs ached from bending over operating tables for hours without rest. But they wrote anyway, because the alternative was to sit alone with thoughts too dark to bear. Lieutenant Agnes Jensen wrote to her sister in Minnesota, "I cleaned a German boy's wounds today. He couldn't have been more than 19. Blonde hair, blue eyes, the kind of face you'd see at a church social back home. He thanked me in German, his eyes full of tears. I wanted to hate him. God help me. I wanted to hate him for what his countrymen have done for the American boys I've watched die for this whole terrible war. But I couldn't. All I could see was someone's son far from home, scared and in pain. What does that make me?" She never sent that letter. It was found decades later in a box of her belongings, folded and unfolded so many times the creases had worn through. Captain Ruth Haskell wrote in her diary with a bluntness that would have shocked the folks back in her Kansas hometown. "We received 30 German POWs today, most with frostbite from the Ardennes. One had gangrene so advanced we had to amputate. He kept apologizing in German while we prepped him for surgery. Apologizing to us. For what? For losing? For being wounded? For being human?" I held his hand while the anesthesia took effect. He squeezed back. I think about that squeeze more than I should. The moral exhaustion seeped through every page. These women had been trained to save lives, but no one had prepared them for the emotional calculus of war. How do you reconcile treating the enemy with the same care you give your own, when your own are dying because of that enemy? How do you maintain compassion when you're running on 3 hours of sleep and the supplies are dwindling? Another convoy of wounded is already approaching. Lieutenant Frances Slanger wrote what would become one of the war's most famous letters, published in Stars and Stripes just days before she was killed by German artillery. She wrote about the GIs she cared for, their courage and humor and resilience. But in her personal journal, she wrote something else. Something that would not be discovered until after her death. A German officer was brought in yesterday, a captain, I think. Severe abdominal wounds. He spoke perfect English, educated in London before the war. He asked me why we were helping him. I told him it was our duty. He said duty did not require kindness. I had no answer for that. What could I say? That we're better than you. That we're proving something. The truth is simpler and more complicated. We help because we must. Because if we don't hold on to our humanity here, in this place where humanity goes to die, then we've already lost the war that matters. These letters and diaries reveal the quiet rebellion that occurred in those field hospitals. A compassion, unapproved by strategy, unsanctioned by command, but rooted in something deeper than orders. A defiance against the dehumanization that war demanded. A stubborn insistence that mercy was not weakness, even when showing it hurt. For years, German soldiers had been fed a steady diet of lies. The propaganda machine of the Third Reich worked with ruthless efficiency, churning out posters and films and speeches that painted the Allies as subhuman. The Americans especially were portrayed as gangsters and criminals, a mongrel nation without culture or honor. They would rape and pillage. They would execute prisoners without trial. Surrender to them meant death, only slower and more humiliating. Every German soldier carried this certainty into battle. It was drilled into them during training, reinforced by their officers, whispered among themselves in foxholes and bunkers. Better to die fighting than to fall into American hands. Better a bullet than whatever torture the enemy had planned. So when they woke in field hospitals alive and unharmed, their minds could not process the contradiction. The cognitive dissonance was physical, a vertigo that had nothing to do with blood loss or morphine. Everything they knew about the world had been wrong. Everything they had been told was a lie. And if that was a lie, what else was? They watched in stunned silence as American nurses moved through the ward. These women did not sneer or curse. They did not withhold medicine or let wounds fester out of spite. They brought soup that was actually warm, blankets that were actually clean. Cigarettes, even American cigarettes that German soldiers had looted from dead GIs and smoked like trophies. Now they were being given freely. One Wehrmacht corporal wrote to his wife in a letter that would be intercepted and filed by American intelligence. They give us the same food they eat. The nurses treat us as though we were their own soldiers. I do not understand it. We were told they were animals, but they are kinder than our own officers ever were. What have we been fighting for? Another, a young private from Hamburg, described his bewilderment in a diary kept secretly in the POW camp. The American nurse who changes my bandages hums while she works. She hummed yesterday. She hummed today. As if caring for the enemy is so natural it requires no thought, no effort, no hatred. How can they be winning the war if they waste compassion on us? Or perhaps that is why they are winning. German medics captured alongside combat troops were perhaps the most shaken. They had seen how their own military treated Soviet prisoners. The cruelty, the deliberate neglect, the wholesale disregard for the Geneva Convention that Germany had signed but never honored. They expected reciprocity. They expected the Americans to mirror the brutality the Wehrmacht had shown to others. Instead, they found themselves working alongside American medical staff, assisting in surgeries on their own countrymen, while American nurses supervised with patient professionalism. One German doctor, a surgeon from Munich, later testified at Nuremberg about his time in American custody. I expected revenge. I received respect. It was harder to bear than punishment would have been because it forced me to confront what we had become. For men raised under fanaticism, this was not weakness they were witnessing. It was something far more dangerous to the ideology they had served. It was kindness, deliberate, systematic, undeniable kindness. And kindness, they were discovering, was a weapon more devastating than any bomb. It shattered certainty. It raised questions that had no comfortable answers. It made them wonder in the long hours of recovery what they had really been fighting for, and whether the monsters in this war had been wearing the wrong uniforms all along. To the Army Nurse Corps, mercy was not optional. It was regulation, written into military code, enshrined in the Geneva Convention of 1929, which declared that all wounded combatants, regardless of nationality, were to receive equal medical treatment. The document was clear, the law was explicit, but on the battlefield, where law dissolved into chaos and regulations meant nothing against the sound of incoming shells, this was not merely doctrine, it was a choice. A choice made 1,000 times a day by women who could have looked the other way, who could have prioritized, who could have let exhaustion and grief harden into the kind of selective compassion that war so easily justified. They chose otherwise. The tradition stretched back further than Geneva, further than the Red Cross founded by Henri Dunant after he witnessed the carnage of Solferino. It reached back to Florence Nightingale in the Crimea, moving through wards with her lamp, treating British and Russian alike, because suffering recognized no flag. It reached back to Clara Barton on Civil War battlefields, kneeling beside Confederate soldiers, even as Union men died waiting for her attention. These American nurses carried that legacy in their veins. They understood perhaps better than the generals who commanded them that how you treat the defeated defines who you are more than how you treat the victorious. That civilization is not measured by the wars you win, but by the mercy you show when winning. But understanding this intellectually and living it practically were different things entirely. It was one thing to believe in universal human dignity in a classroom stateside. It was another to practice it when the man on the stretcher wore the same uniform as the sniper who killed your friend yesterday. When his countrymen had bombed the hospital tent 2 weeks ago, killing 3 nurses who never made it home. When you were so tired, you could barely stand, and the morphine was running low, and you had to decide who received it first. In those moments, the choice to treat all wounded equally was not passive adherence to regulation. It was active defiance against everything war wanted them to become. Every German wound cleaned without malice was a quiet declaration. We will not become what we fight. We will not let this war turn us into the cruelty we oppose. Through gauze and morphine, through whispered reassurances and gentle hands, they preserved something the war itself was designed to destroy. Not just lives, though they saved thousands of those. They preserved the idea that humanity could survive inhumanity, that compassion could coexist with conflict, that you could fight a war without becoming consumed by it. The nurses themselves rarely spoke of it in such grand terms. In their letters and diaries, they were matter-of-fact, almost dismissive of their own actions. We just did our jobs, they would say decades later when historians came asking. We were trained to help the wounded. That's what we did. But their jobs required no kindness. Their training did not mandate gentle words or patient explanations, or the extra minutes spent holding a frightened soldier's hand. Those were choices. Small choices, perhaps in the vast machinery of total war. But small choices repeated thousands of times across hundreds of field hospitals accumulated into something larger. They accumulated into proof that the moral high ground was not merely propaganda, that American ideals so often spoken about in lofty rhetoric could be lived in the mud and blood of the front lines, that the difference between civilization and barbarism was not technology or tactics. It was this, the conscious decision to see the enemy as human and to treat him accordingly, even when it cost you something to do so. Christmas Eve, 1944. The war did not pause for holidays. The guns continued their percussion through the frozen forest. Artillery shells traced arcs of light across the darkness like falling stars that brought only death. But inside the field hospital tent, someone had tried to make it feel like something other than war. The nurses had hung paper stars from the IV poles cut from medical supply wrappers and coloured with whatever they could find. Red Cross armbands provided the red. Iodine stains on gauze created amber and gold. Someone had fashioned a small tree from pine branches decorated with spent bullet casings, polished until they gleamed like ornaments. It was ridiculous and beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. The American soldiers appreciated the effort. They sang carols between doses of morphine, their voices rough but earnest, Jingle Bells and White Christmas, and all the songs that reminded them of homes they might never see again. The nurses joined in harmonizing while they worked, changing dressings to the rhythm of Silent Night. Then, from the cots where the German prisoners lay, a low murmur began, hesitant at first. One voice, then another, then a dozen. The words were different, but the melody was unmistakable. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. The Americans fell silent. The nurses paused, bandages hanging forgotten in their hands. For a moment, the only sound was German voices rising in tentative unison, singing the song their mothers had sung to them, the song that transcended uniforms and flags and all the reasons men found to kill each other. Then, one of the nurses, a girl from Pennsylvania, whose grandfather had emigrated from Bavaria, joined softly in English, "Silent night, holy night." Her voice bridged the languages, the same notes carrying different words toward the same meaning. All is calm, all is bright. Others joined. American soldiers in their cots, nurses moving between the rows. Even some of the doctor's men who had spent 18-hour shifts elbow deep in carnage found themselves singing. The tent became a strange and sacred space where, for 3 minutes and 42 seconds, the war dissolved. Not Americans, not Germans, just humans longing for peace. When the song ended, silence settled like snow. Some men wept openly. Others simply closed their eyes, holding on to the moment before it slipped away. One young German private, barely 18, turned to the nurse beside him and said in careful, practiced English, "Thank you, for this, for everything." She squeezed his shoulder, unable to speak, past the tightness in her throat. The moments of connection came in smaller ways too. A German officer, a former schoolteacher from Dresden, spent his recovery teaching English phrases to the nurses who wanted to communicate better with their patients. In return, they taught him American slang, laughing together at his pronunciation of swell and jeepers. Another soldier, a carpenter's apprentice from Cologne, carved small wooden figurines during his convalescence. Birds and horses and delicate flowers shaped from whatever scrap wood he could find. He gave them to the nurses as thank you gifts, pressing them into their hands with silent gratitude that needed no translation. Letters were written that would be kept for lifetimes. A Wehrmacht corporal penned a note to the nurse who had saved his leg from amputation, decorated with a sketch of her face as he remembered it, haloed by lamplight. She carried it through the rest of the war in her breast pocket over her heart, a reminder of why she had chosen this impossible profession. These were not grand gestures. They would never appear in official histories or military records, but they were the moments that proved something essential about human nature, that even in the depths of hatred connection was possible, that even in war people could choose to see each other, that mercy once given could never be completely forgotten. May 8th, 1945, victory in Europe. The guns finally fell silent. Church bells rang across the continent, their sound strange and unfamiliar after years of artillery thunder. Soldiers wept and danced and got drunk on liberated champagne. Cities erupted in celebration. But in the field hospitals, the work continued. The war might have ended, but its consequences were still bleeding on 1,000 stretchers. The German prisoners of war were processed and transferred. Some went to camps in France and Belgium. Others were shipped across the Atlantic to facilities in America, farmland camps in Kansas and Texas and Ohio, where they would spend months or years waiting to go home to a Germany that no longer existed in the form they remembered. Many of them carried memories of the American nurses who had treated them. They spoke of it in the camps, comparing notes, sharing stories that seemed too improbable to be true but were verified by too many witnesses to be dismissed. The nurse with red hair who sang while she worked. The one who spoke German and explained everything patiently. The one who had held a dying soldier's hand through his final moments, whispering prayers in English over a boy who probably didn't understand the words, but understood the comfort. In POW camps across America, German soldiers were treated to a continuation of the mercy they had first encountered on the battlefield. They were fed adequately, housed in barracks that, while Spartan, were clean and heated. Some were allowed to work on local farms, earning small wages and interacting with American civilians, who often treated them with curiosity rather than hatred. They wrote letters home when mail service was restored, tentative letters to wives and mothers and sisters trying to explain what they had experienced, trying to reconcile the propaganda they had believed with the reality they had lived. One former SS officer, his certainties shattered by months in American custody, wrote to his brother still imprisoned by the Soviets, "You will not believe me when I tell you this. I scarcely believe it myself, but the Americans are not what we were told. Their nurses treated me better than our own doctors ever did. I do not know what this means for everything we fought for. Years passed, decades. The prisoners were repatriated to a divided Germany, returning to cities reduced to rubble, and a nation forced to confront the magnitude of its crimes. Many tried to forget the war entirely, burying memories too painful to examine. But some could not forget the kindness. Letters arrived at veterans' organizations addressed simply to the American nurse somewhere in France, 1944. They came from former soldiers who had spent years searching for the women who had saved them, wanting to say thank you one more time, wanting to tell them that the mercy had mattered, that it had changed something fundamental in how they understood the world. A few found their nurses. Reunions occurred in the 1,960 seconds and 70 seconds, awkward meetings between elderly women and the men they had treated as wounded boys. They met in living rooms in America and Germany, drinking coffee and sharing photographs, speaking haltingly about experiences that still felt too large for words. One nurse, Sarah Henderson, met the German soldier whose leg she had saved in the Ardennes. He owned a bakery in Munich, now had children and grandchildren, a whole life that existed because she had refused to let him die. He brought her bread he had baked himself and wept as he handed it to her. "You gave me my life," he said. "I have spent 40 years trying to be worthy of that gift." She took his hands in hers. These hands she had once bandaged and said simply, "You were always worthy. That's why we helped." In the ruins of Europe, much was destroyed. Cities reduced to skeletal frameworks of what they had been. Armies shattered and scattered. Beliefs that had seemed unshakable crumbled into ash and doubt. The physical devastation was immense, measurable in tonnage of bombs dropped and acres of land scorched. But the spiritual devastation ran deeper still. Yet, amid it all, one truth endured. Kindness is not weakness, it is resistance. Every wound treated without hatred was an act of defiance against the very nature of total war. Total war demanded total commitment. It required you to see the enemy as less than human, because only then could you do what war required. Only then could you kill efficiently, destroy completely, pursue victory without the burden of conscience. But these nurses refused that bargain. In their refusal, they did more than heal bodies. They reminded the world what it meant to remain civilized in the face of barbarism, what it meant to hold on to principles when principles seemed like luxuries no one could afford. Their compassion disarmed more than bullets ever could. It disarmed the propaganda that sustained hatred. It disarmed the certainties that made war possible. It forced both sides to confront an uncomfortable truth that the enemy was human, too capable of suffering and deserving of mercy, and that this fact complicated every justification for violence. The German soldiers who experienced that mercy carried it home like shrapnel that never fully healed. It changed how they spoke about the war, how they remembered it, how they taught their children about the Americans they had fought. Not as monsters, not as the faceless evil they had been trained to destroy, but as people who had chosen compassion when cruelty would have been easier. In choosing mercy, the nurses won a victory that outlasted the armistice. They won the war for what America claimed to represent. They proved that the ideals were real, that they could survive contact with the worst humanity had to offer. They kept the flame alive when everything else was burning. When history counts the victors of war, it names generals and battles and nations. It measures victory and territory gained and enemies defeated. It erects monuments to the soldiers who stormed beaches and held lines and gave their lives for strategic objectives that seemed in the moment to mean everything. But the quiet victories, the ones that kept humanity alive when inhumanity reigned, belonged to others. To the women who faced death not with rifles but with bandages, who saw an enemy not as evil but as human, who chose in 1,000 small moments across 1,000 brutal days to respond to hatred with care. In their hands the defeated found dignity. In their compassion the victors found their conscience. They proved that you could fight a war without becoming the war. That strength was not only measured in how hard you could strike, but in how much mercy you could offer when you had every reason not to. War changes men. It scars them, breaks them, sometimes destroys them entirely. But kindness changes history. It writes a different story than the one violence tells. A story about who we are, when everything is stripped away except the choice between cruelty and compassion. Between seeing another person's suffering and choosing to look away or choosing to help. These nurses chose to help, and in that choice they won something no army ever could. They won the right to say, when the guns fell silent and the accounting began, that they had remained human, that they had kept faith with the better angels of their nature, that they had treated the enemy with the same mercy they hoped to receive should the fortunes of war ever reverse. They were not perfect. They were exhausted, frightened, sometimes bitter, about the impossible task they had been given. But they were there in the mud and the blood and the chaos, holding the line between civilization and savagery, with nothing more than gauze and will and the stubborn belief that every life mattered. 16 nurses killed in action, over 1 million soldiers treated, Allied and German alike. Each one a choice, each one a quiet defiance against everything war demanded. The sound of silent night fades into memory. The tent dissolves into history. But the lesson endures, written in the space between what war requires and what humanity refuses to surrender. Some victories are counted in miles, others in moments of mercy that echo across generations, reminding us that even in our darkest hours, we can still choose kindness. And that choice, made again and again by women whose names most will never know, may have been the most important victory of all.